A nighttime intrigue, lovers, neighbors, and a mysterious stranger. Jacob woke abruptly, the clock on the bedside table glowing 2:13 a.m. A sense of unease gripped him, as if an invisible force had tugged him out of sleep. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow flitted across his mind, but he couldn't pinpoint what exactly had triggered the feeling. He listened to the silence in the house, hearing only the steady breathing of his wife, Brianna. The feeling that something was amiss intensified. Jacob quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Brianna. His bare feet moved soundlessly across the wooden floor. In the kitchen, he drank a glass of water, hoping to calm himself, but the anxiety didn't fade. His attention was drawn to a faint sound from the backyard, like someone darting past the window. He paused by the kitchen window, peering into the darkness. It was silent, eerily so, but after a few seconds, he saw Brianna's figure emerge in the yard. She was wearing a light robe, her face illuminated only by the pale glimmer of moonlight. Jacob watched as she moved toward the back fence. Brianna tried to be cautious, but her movements betrayed nervousness. She glanced over her shoulder, as if to ensure no one was watching. Moments later, Harry, their neighbor, approached her. Jacob had known Harry for a few years. He seemed friendly, though occasionally overly talkative, but nothing about him had ever aroused suspicion before. Brianna handed Harry something that resembled a small package. Her hand lingered in the air a moment longer than necessary. Harry took the package, said something quietly, and they parted ways. Jacob returned to the bedroom, questions swirling in his mind. What was that? He thought. His mind searched for a rational explanation. Perhaps it was something innocent? Maybe Harry had simply asked Brianna for help? But why would she meet him in the middle of the night without any explanation? He slipped back into bed, careful not to wake his wife. Brianna was already asleep, turned away from him, but Jacob could feel her tension, as if she wasn't truly at rest. The next morning, Jacob decided not to confront her immediately. He observed Brianna closely, trying to discern any signs that might reveal her emotional state. Her behavior was as usual. She made coffee, kissed him before leaving for work, and left the kitchen spotless. Everything seemed perfect, but Jacob noticed one small detail: her phone. Brianna usually left it on the kitchen counter while getting ready for work. Today, she kept it with her, even when she went into the bathroom. It was a minor detail, but to Jacob, it was a key to something hidden. The day dragged on endlessly. Jacob couldn't focus on work, his mind replaying the events of the night. Various theories brewed in his head. Perhaps it was just an ordinary exchange, like a book or tools, but his intuition told him otherwise. That evening, when Brianna returned home, Jacob acted as though everything was normal. They had dinner, watched a series, and even laughed together. But in his mind, he had made a clear decision. He needed to uncover the truth. Around midnight, when Brianna went to bed, Jacob stepped outside. His eyes searched for any evidence that could explain the nighttime encounter. By the fence, he found a small scrap of paper, seemingly fallen from the package. It was tiny and barely noticeable, but it bore words written in neat handwriting. "Tell him later. Not now." This only deepened Jacob's confusion. He went back into the house, but this time his anxiety turned into firm resolve. Jacob knew he wouldn't rest until he discovered the truth. The next morning, Jacob woke with a clear plan. He decided to wait until Brianna left the house to thoroughly search her belongings. Inside him, a storm raged, love and doubt battling each other. Could Brianna, his wife of over 5 years, be hiding something from him? He pushed these thoughts aside and prepared to act. Brianna was a woman impossible to ignore. Her dark chestnut hair was always perfectly styled, and her elegant yet understated fashion sense always drew attention. She worked at a local gallery, organizing exhibitions and mingling with artists and collectors. Her charming smile and conversational skills made her the soul of any gathering. Yet, Jacob sometimes noticed a hint of reserve in her, as if she didn't always reveal all her thoughts. Jacob, on the other hand, was her opposite. Tall, with a slightly unkempt hairstyle and a casual dress sense, he was a programmer who preferred quiet evenings with a book or his computer. His brown, somewhat tired eyes reflected the calm and patience that often helped him in challenging situations. He trusted people, but that trust was now fractured. That day, Brianna left for work a bit earlier than usual. She hugged Jacob as always, leaving the warm trace of her perfume on his shoulder, but Jacob sensed something artificial in her behavior. As soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, he set his plan into motion. Neatly folded clothes, a few shoeboxes, nothing unusual. He opened the top drawer of the dresser and found an envelope with cash. This surprised him since they always used credit cards. In the bottom drawer, he came across a box of letters. Most were from friends or family, but one letter caught his attention. It was unsigned, containing only a few lines typed on a typewriter. Meeting at 11. Don't be late. He mustn't find out. Jacob's heart pounded. He tried to make sense of the message, but every thought that came to mind only made him more anxious. Was this letter from Harry? Or someone else? Jacob decided not to stop. He opened Brianna's laptop, hoping to find more clues. The password was unchanged, the date of their wedding, which brought a bitter smile to his face. Her email contained nothing suspicious, but in the drafts folder, he found another note. I've arranged it with him. He'll do it quietly. The main thing is that Jacob doesn't suspect anything. His mind raced with thousands of thoughts. What exactly was Brianna planning? Who was this he? And what did do it quietly mean? That evening, Jacob decided to carefully question her without raising suspicion. Over dinner, he started the conversation. How was your day? Fine, Brianna replied easily. I worked on a new exhibition. One of the artists missed their deadline, so I'm fixing it now. Jacob nodded, pretending he was satisfied with the answer. Did you see Harry today? He asked suddenly. Harry? No. Why do you ask? Brianna raised an eyebrow, her tone casual, but Jacob noticed how her hands clenched her napkin slightly tighter. Just saw him in the yard yesterday. He seemed to be looking for something near the fence, Jacob said, trying to sound indifferent. Maybe he was looking for his dog, Brianna smiled, but her eyes remained tense. This brief exchange only deepened his suspicions. He resolved to act more decisively. Late that night, after Brianna fell asleep, Jacob carefully took her phone and entered the password. He knew it was wrong, but his need to uncover the truth outweighed his guilt. Scrolling through her messages, he found a conversation with an unknown number. It was brief but extremely suspicious. Everything is ready. Tomorrow, as agreed. Jacob felt his heart stop. Breathing was hard, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He needed to know everything before jumping to conclusions. He set the phone down and quietly lay back in bed next to Brianna, feeling her calm breathing. But his mind wouldn't let him sleep. Tomorrow, he was determined to follow her and find out what she was hiding. Jacob woke up earlier than usual. He was so focused on his mission that he didn't even notice his hands trembling as he prepared coffee. Brianna was still asleep, peacefully sprawled across the bed as if nothing in the world could bother her. Jacob watched her closely, trying to figure out if her calm demeanor was just an act or if she truly had no idea he'd uncovered part of her secrets. When Brianna woke up, she behaved as she always did. Her eyes showed no sign of tension. She smiled at Jacob and began getting ready for work. I'll be home late today, she said, fastening her earrings in front of the mirror. We have a long meeting with a collector and then exhibition prep. Got it, Jacob replied, trying to sound casual. Good luck. He watched her leave the house before springing into action. This time, Jacob decided to be more cautious and thorough. He knew he couldn't afford a mistake. A few minutes after Brianna left, Jacob went to her wardrobe. This time, his attention was drawn to a small black suitcase that always sat in the corner. The suitcase appeared empty but was surprisingly heavy. He opened it to find several sealed documents, a gold bracelet he'd never seen before, and a set of keys. Jacob took the keys, but returned everything else to its place. His mind raced with questions. What were the keys for? What were the documents? To dispel his suspicions, Jacob decided to follow Brianna. He knew her car was equipped with a GPS tracker they had installed years ago for convenience. Jacob opened the app on his phone and saw her car parked near a downtown cafe. Jacob didn't waste time. He quickly dressed, got in his car, and drove there. Parking at a distance to avoid being noticed, he carefully watched the entrance. A few minutes later, Brianna emerged from the cafe, but not alone. She was speaking with a well-dressed, slightly nervous-looking middle-aged man. Jacob had never seen him before, but it certainly wasn't Harry. The man gestured intensely, explaining something passionately, while Brianna listened attentively. Their conversation seemed tense. Jacob decided to move closer, hoping to catch at least part of what they were saying. "Everything needs to go smoothly," the man insisted. "We can't afford any mistakes." "I understand," Brianna replied. "Just make sure he doesn't suspect anything. If this falls apart, it'll all be for nothing." Jacob barely restrained himself from stepping closer. He knew it might be dangerous. Suddenly, Brianna glanced at her watch and quickly said goodbye to the man, promising to call him later. She got into her car and drove off. Jacob decided to stay and follow the man instead. He watched as the man briskly walked a few blocks and entered a small office building. Jacob memorized the address, intending to investigate who this man was and what he did. Back at home, Jacob felt more confused than ever. He had keys he couldn't identify, a stranger connected to Brianna, and conversations that only deepened his doubts. He knew the truth was close, but still out of reach. That evening, when Brianna returned home, Jacob acted as if nothing had happened. They had dinner together, discussed mundane topics, but inside, Jacob was a storm of emotions. He observed her every move, looking for anything unusual. She seemed as calm as always. Later, when Brianna was asleep, Jacob took the keys he had found in her suitcase and began experimenting. He went around the entire house, testing locks, but none of the keys fit. This meant they opened something outside the house. But what? Jacob knew this question demanded an answer, and he was determined to find it. Jacob decided to learn more about the mysterious man Brianna had met. He remembered the address of the office building the man had entered and decided to start his investigation there. Jacob took his time, understanding that every step needed to be cautious and calculated. Dressing simply to avoid attracting attention, he headed to the building. Once inside, Jacob quickly got his bearings. Near the entrance, a directory of companies located in the building hung on the wall. His eyes stopped at a plaque that read, "Travis Gray, Independent Consultant." The vague title raised his suspicions, as it didn't explain the nature of Travis's work. Jacob decided it was worth investigating. He took the elevator to the third floor and walked to a door marked with Travis's name. The door was locked, but through a small glass panel, Jacob could see that the office was empty. This gave him time to think about his next move. He went back downstairs and settled into a cafe across the street, taking a seat near the window with a clear view of the building entrance. Jacob decided to wait for the man to reappear. About an hour later, Travis finally exited the building. Jacob immediately got up, leaving a few dollars for his coffee, and began following him. Travis walked confidently, but his movements were slightly nervous. He kept glancing around, which Jacob found odd. Could Travis sense that he was being followed? Jacob kept a safe distance, blending into the crowd of pedestrians. Travis entered a small building on the other side of the block that appeared to be a regular residential property. Jacob stopped on the sidewalk, debating whether to follow him inside. He decided not to risk it, and instead waited outside to see if anyone else would come out. A few minutes later, a woman exited the building. She looked flustered, as if something had upset her. Jacob thought she looked familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. While he was trying to figure out who the woman was, Travis reappeared on the doorstep. He quickly headed toward his car, and Jacob decided to continue following him. Travis drove a few blocks and stopped at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Jacob parked at a safe distance and watched as Travis entered the building. Keeping his distance, Jacob noticed that the warehouse was surrounded by a high fence and a guard stood at the entrance. This place seemed far more secure than a typical warehouse. Jacob took out his phone and snapped a few photos, intending to research the location later. While he waited, another car exited from the opposite side of the warehouse. Jacob managed to quickly take a few photos of its license plate. He decided that was enough for one day. Returning home might be risky, as Travis could notice he was being followed, but Jacob carefully maintained a safe distance to avoid detection. As soon as Jacob got home, he began searching for information. The license plate he had photographed belonged to a company connected to private investigations. This only deepened the mystery. He also found some details about the warehouse, which was used to store artwork. This could be related to Brianna's work, but why would she keep such details hidden? When Brianna returned that evening, Jacob acted as though nothing was wrong. She looked a bit tired but showed no signs that anything might be amiss. Jacob listened carefully to her recount her day, trying to find even the smallest clue, but everything she said seemed ordinary. That night, Jacob once again couldn't sleep. He lay in bed for hours, replaying everything he had seen. His suspicions grew stronger, but he still couldn't piece together the connection between Brianna, Travis, and the warehouse. One thing was certain. He had to find answers, even if it meant taking risks. Brianna had become more distant, often staying late for meetings after work. Her behavior had changed, and Jacob couldn't help but notice. Her gaze had grown colder, and her words less sincere. She started shutting him out, even when they were home together. Evenings were spent on her phone or laptop, with little regard for what was happening around her. Jacob's nerves were wearing thin, and he couldn't understand why she was acting this way. What had changed? One evening, when he came home from work, Brianna was absent again. She had left a note, "I'll be late, meeting with a client." This wasn't the first time she'd left such a note, but something about this one felt different. Jacob sat on the couch, feeling his patience ebb away with each passing minute. He couldn't bear her lies and coldness any longer. When Brianna returned, she was in a good mood, but Jacob immediately sensed that something was off. She seemed too calm, perhaps even overly cheerful. Her eyes lacked the sadness they had carried before, and her words came out too excitedly and too quickly. "How was the meeting?" Jacob asked, trying to remain composed. "Oh, it was great. Everything went really well. The client was very pleased," she replied, laughing slightly, forgetting even to ask how his day had gone. This was unusual. She used to always care about his day. "And will you be having more of these late meetings?" Jacob asked, unable to hide his wariness. Brianna shrugged, as if it were a trivial matter. "Maybe a few more times, but don't worry, it won't last long." Those words hit Jacob hard. He noticed how her eyes dimmed for a moment, only to light up again with a spark of energy. Something was wrong. She was clearly hiding something. Her behavior, every movement, confirmed it. He realized he couldn't just sit idly by anymore. That evening, when Brianna left again for another meeting, Jacob decided to act. He went to her home office and began sifting through her documents and exhibition notes. After a few minutes of searching, he came across something interesting. She had written down a phone number he didn't recognize. This wasn't random, and Jacob felt it could be a crucial clue. He took a photo of the number and began searching through databases. Before long, Jacob discovered that the number belonged to someone named Oscar. He worked in logistics and had questionable ties to private investigators and criminal organizations. Jacob was shocked. Why was Brianna involved with such a man? What was she planning? This couldn't just be a coincidence. His next step was clear. He decided to conduct a night of surveillance. He knew Brianna would likely leave for another meeting, so he prepared in advance. Long before she set off, Jacob tracked her every move. Once she left the house, he quickly got into his car and followed her. He kept a safe distance, ensuring she wouldn't notice him. They drove through several blocks before reaching an old, unremarkable building in the industrial part of the city. Jacob parked nearby and saw Brianna enter the building, which he recognized as a warehouse linked to the art world. He was both surprised and suspicious, as everything he had learned so far seemed to fit into some larger picture. He waited for hours. Finally, two people emerged from the warehouse, Brianna and Oscar. She didn't look surprised. On the contrary, she seemed confident as she spoke with him, even laughing. Jacob felt his heart race. This wasn't just work. This was something more. And it wasn't just a coincidence. It involved someone connected to all these shady dealings. Now Jacob knew exactly what he had to do. He couldn't ignore this any longer. But what next? What was he supposed to do with all this information? His emotions clashed violently within him, and he teetered on the edge, ready for an act of revenge that could change his life forever. Jacob felt the weight of suspicion and doubt slowly suffocating him. His heart didn't want to accept what he had seen. He couldn't believe that Brianna might have betrayed him and that all of this wasn't just a coincidence. He tried to dismiss the evidence he had gathered, convincing himself it might all be a misunderstanding. But each time he was left alone with his thoughts, his doubts returned like a cold wind. That evening, Jacob came home utterly exhausted. Too many observations, too much thinking, too many questions. Brianna was still out, which gave him a brief sense of relief. He shrugged off his coat and slowly walked to the kitchen, a place that always felt calm, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He needed to gather himself, to find clarity, even if only for a few minutes. He sat at the table, staring at the dark screen of his phone. He scrolled through his contact list, contemplating his next move. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway caught his attention. Someone had entered the door. It was Harry, one of Brianna's old friends who often visited when Jacob wasn't home. Harry was tall, with a slightly scruffy beard that looked a bit unkempt. He had always been friendly, but lately, Jacob had noticed he often came over unannounced. Tonight, though, Harry seemed different. He entered without a word and walked straight to the kitchen, not even taking off his coat. "Hey, Jacob, how's it going?" Harry smiled, but it was a nervous, unnatural smile. "Hi, Harry. I'm fine," Jacob replied, trying not to reveal his emotions. "Weren't you heading to some meeting?" "Oh, a meeting? No, I just decided to drop by and hang out for a bit. Brianna said she was free tonight, so I thought I'd stop in." Jacob couldn't help but notice how Harry stayed longer than usual. They sat together, but there was no real reason for their prolonged conversation. Harry increasingly acted as though he were in his own home, and Jacob began to sense a certain tension in the air. "So, what's new with you?" Harry asked, casually steering the conversation toward a topic that clearly interested him. "Brianna hasn't mentioned much about work lately. She's always so tired, isn't she?" These words immediately caught Jacob's attention. Once again, he felt that strange dissonance. Something deeper was happening between him and his so-called friend, beyond just a friendly chat. "Yeah, she is," Jacob replied, his heart beating a little faster. "She's been working a lot more recently." Harry took a sip of his coffee and smiled, as if trying to hide his own weariness from the situation. "Yeah, I've noticed that. She's always so busy. Sometimes she's around, and other times she's just gone. But that's normal, right? Everyone's in such a rush these days," Harry said, attempting to sound nonchalant. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Harry was clearly trying to hide something. His demeanor was too tense for what should have been an ordinary, friendly conversation. "Well, you know," Jacob decided to try a different approach, "I still don't think it's normal. She's always been more open when we're together. Now, it's like something's pulling her away from me." For a moment, Harry fell silent, his gaze less confident. He nervously glanced at Jacob, but quickly tried to steer the conversation back to a more casual tone. "You're probably just overthinking things," Harry said, changing the subject. "She's just been working a lot, that's all." But Jacob didn't believe him. Harry was too quick to dismiss his concerns, too tense, and it only confirmed Jacob's suspicions. Why was Harry so eager to convince him that everything was fine? And why did he stay longer than usual, even when there was no reason to? A few minutes later, Brianna returned home. She looked a bit tired but calm. Harry was still there, and she seemed slightly surprised that he'd stayed so long. "Harry, you're still here?" she asked, trying to smile. "Yeah, everything's fine. I just decided to stick around a bit longer," Harry replied, casually waving it off, not even bothering to explain why he had lingered. Brianna glanced at Jacob for a moment, but he betrayed no emotion. She had no idea that an unusual, silent game had just played out between him and Harry. Jacob remained quiet, observing their interactions. All these little details were starting to add up. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that what he had seen and heard couldn't simply be dismissed as coincidence. Harry, her absences, the late-night meetings, and even how she now acted, all of it was becoming part of a larger puzzle that Jacob was slowly piecing together. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that soon he would have to make a choice. Jacob was stunned when he saw a man moving into the house next door. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was Oscar, the same man he had seen with Brianna at the warehouse. The new neighbor didn't seem like a typical newcomer. Reserved, nearly silent, with a cold, unfriendly gaze. Oscar never drew attention to himself, but always seemed to be watching from a distance, often appearing only at night. His presence in the neighborhood was immediately noticeable, as was his tendency to linger in the shadows. Jacob had seen him a few times, standing on his porch, watching either him or Brianna through the window. It all began unexpectedly. That day, Jacob came home earlier than usual and saw Brianna quickly entering the house, clutching a document in her hands. He barely had time to process it when Oscar suddenly appeared beside him. Jacob nearly collided with him as he passed by his yard. It seemed like Oscar had been waiting for this moment. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," Oscar said, smiling faintly, though his eyes remained cold. "I just noticed you, Jacob. I'm not sure if you remember me, but I'm the new neighbor. I moved in next door." "Yeah, I heard you moved in," Jacob replied, trying to remain polite, though inwardly he felt this encounter was no coincidence. Oscar stepped back slightly, speaking as though carefully weighing his words before saying something significant. "I know how hard it can be when misunderstandings arise in your life. Things aren't always what they seem," he said, clasping his hands tightly. "Don't trust what you see." Jacob looked at Oscar, puzzled. The tone in which he said this was calm, but there was a hint of warning in his words. Something about them made Jacob pause. "Are you saying I'm missing something important?" Jacob asked, unsure if he had understood the mysterious man correctly. Oscar fell silent for a moment, but his gaze grew sharper. "I'm not exactly sure what's going on, Jacob, but you trust appearances too much. Sometimes what we want to see clouds what is truly there. Harry, for example. You don't know who he really is." Jacob felt something ignite within him. Harry. That name had been troubling him for a long time. Why was Oscar mentioning him? This was more than just a coincidence. Jacob watched as Oscar released these words with almost no emotion. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would casually comment on a neighbor's life unless he knew something important. "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, keeping his eyes fixed on Oscar. Oscar paused, as if weighing whether he should continue. He glanced over the woven fence toward Jacob's house, as though checking to make sure no one else was around. "I've noticed how you interact with him," Oscar said. "Brianna wasn't always like this. She changed after she started spending time with Harry." These words dropped like a heavy stone into Jacob's heart. He couldn't respond immediately. It was hard for him to process what Oscar was saying, but his intuition told him he needed to keep listening. "Are you saying that Harry and Brianna?" Jacob couldn't finish the sentence, but his gaze grew heavier. Oscar nodded slowly. "I can't say much more," he added quietly. "But remember this. Not everything is as it seems." Jacob stared deeply at Oscar once more. His words left more questions than answers. How could Oscar know so much about Brianna and Harry when he seemed to have just moved into the neighborhood? And why had he chosen to tell Jacob all this? Oscar frowned and suddenly said, "I just want you to be ready for what's coming. If you need help, I'm here." These words were the final push Jacob needed to start searching for answers to all his questions. Oscar had become another link in this mysterious game, where every player seemed to be more than they appeared on the surface. When Oscar left him alone, Jacob felt as though he was on the brink of something significant. With each new fact and every new suspicion, he grew closer to uncovering the truth. He could no longer afford to delay. He had to figure out what was really happening in his life. Jacob woke up with a bitter heaviness in his heart. His thoughts, which constantly revolved around Brianna, wouldn't leave him alone. His phone vibrated in his pocket, signaling an incoming message. Jacob took it out and saw a series of photos on the screen. Brianna and Harry, laughing together in the backyard, their arms around each other. These were moments when she had been out of the house, but her smile in these photos was too close, too intimate to be purely friendly. At the bottom of the screen was a small note. "Not everything is what it seems." Signed, Oscar. These words reminded Jacob of their last conversation, and his heart clenched with irritation and pain. What did this mean? Why had Oscar sent him these photos? Perhaps this was the last straw. Jacob knew he had to find out more, even if it would hurt. When Brianna returned home from work, Jacob felt like he was at his breaking point. He watched as she walked through the door, took off her jacket, and headed to the bathroom. He knew this was his chance. "Brianna, we need to talk," he said when she returned to the kitchen. She looked at him with slight surprise but showed no signs of panic. "About what, Jacob?" she asked, walking over to the table where their coffee cups sat. Jacob took a deep breath. "I've seen the photos. You and Harry. What do they mean?" he asked, watching her reaction. Brianna averted her eyes, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup, and she let out a faint sigh. "They're just photos, Jacob. Harry is just a friend, a neighbor. Nothing more," she said, raising her gaze. But her eyes seemed distant. There was something in her voice that didn't ring true. Jacob couldn't stay silent anymore. "I don't think it's just friendship," he said coldly. "And why are you spending so much time with him? You're trying to hide something, Brianna." For the first time, she looked unsettled. "Are you out of your mind? Harry is a normal person. Don't make him out to be more than he is." But Jacob felt she was lying. He couldn't leave it at that. He needed to know more, and he decided to take action. Jacob went to Oscar's house, knowing this would be a risky move. He had already taken some cash with him, just in case. Oscar had made it clear more than once that he was willing to talk, but only on his terms. When he knocked on the door, Oscar opened it after a few moments and looked at him with no emotion. "Jacob, what are you doing here?" he asked, neither inviting him in nor refusing him entry. "I need to talk," Jacob said, handing him the money. "This is what we discussed. I want to know what you know about Brianna and Harry. I can't take this anymore. Did you send me those photos? You know more than I do." Oscar took the money but didn't reply immediately. He closed the door and led Jacob to his table, where an empty wine bottle sat. "Let's talk," Oscar said, sitting down. "But remember, this isn't a simple situation. To get answers, you need more evidence. You can't just believe what you see. So you do know more?" Jacob asked, his heart beating faster. He couldn't believe this was happening. "I only suspect," Oscar said, shrugging. "I've heard things, seen them meet often, but you know, not everything is as it appears." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, nervously fidgeting with his fingers. "Do you think they're cheating?" Oscar was silent for a few seconds before responding. "I can't say for sure, but if you want to know, I once saw them at the warehouse together. I thought they were hiding something, that it was more than just meetings." Jacob stared at Oscar for a moment, his thoughts spinning in place. "So you thought it could be an affair too?" he asked, trying to sense if Oscar was being truthful or manipulative. "I can't confirm it, Jacob. You know how important it is to have facts. You need to watch more carefully until you're 100% sure." "And what am I supposed to do with this?" Jacob asked, feeling both anger and despair. Oscar looked at him seriously. "For now, it's best not to say anything to Brianna. You need more evidence. Then, you can decide what to do." Jacob understood that this was only the beginning. Whatever happened, he had to find out the truth. Jacob woke to strange noises. At first, he thought it was just some nighttime sound, but with each passing second, they became clearer. A creak of the floorboards, quiet footsteps. He cautiously opened his eyes, scanning the room, but Brianna wasn't beside him. His heart raced. He couldn't understand why she wasn't in bed, especially since they'd been lying there together just a few hours earlier. He got up and began quietly moving around the room, searching for any sign of her presence. After checking the bathroom and every room, Jacob realized she wasn't in the house. What did this mean? He decided not to panic, but felt his heart pounding harder, an anxious feeling growing that he couldn't ignore. Carefully, trying not to make a single unnecessary sound, Jacob approached the window and peeked outside. His eyes scanned the darkness until he spotted two figures standing near the fence, Brianna and Harry. He couldn't believe his eyes. They stood very close to each other. Harry was saying something, and Brianna listened, her expression serious and focused. They seemed absorbed in an important conversation. Then Harry handed her an envelope, their hands brushing against each other, and he pulled her into an embrace. She didn't pull away. Instead, she opened her arms and let him hold her. This wasn't just a hug. It was something more. Something romantic. Jacob couldn't watch any longer. His heart clenched with pain, and a storm of questions swirled in his mind. What did this mean? Over and over, the same scene replayed in his mind. Brianna in Harry's arms, and that envelope he had given her. What was she hiding from him? What kind of deal did they have? When Jacob woke up, he couldn't shake the thoughts from the night before. Brianna acted as she always did, but she couldn't ignore the fact that her husband was tense and withdrawn. She even asked him what was wrong, but Jacob didn't say anything. He wasn't ready to talk to her about it. Instead, he picked up his phone and sent a message to Oscar. He couldn't wait for him to call, feeling like only Oscar could provide some answers. A few hours later, the call came. Jacob answered, unable to hide his anxiety. "Jacob, I found out something interesting about Harry," Oscar said, his voice serious, as if he truly had important information. "What did you find out?" Jacob asked, no longer able to control his desperation. "What's going on with Brianna and Harry?" Oscar was silent for a few seconds, as though choosing his words carefully. "Harry isn't who he seems to be. He's a con artist, Jacob. He uses women for his schemes. He works with a few people in an underground business, and Brianna isn't his first victim. You probably don't realize how deep this goes, but you need to know that your wife is involved too." Jacob felt his heart grow heavy, like a stone. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you saying that Brianna is involved in his schemes? How is that possible? Why would she do that?" Jacob asked, no longer hiding his frustration. "I don't know the whole picture, Jacob, but I've seen them working together, and I can tell you this isn't the first time she's been connected to this type of business. You need to be very careful because Harry won't back down, and if she's guilty of something, it's in his best interest that you don't find out everything." Jacob sat holding the phone, his face reflecting his panic. How could this be happening? He couldn't believe that his wife, his Brianna, could be involved in something like this. He recalled all the times she stayed late at work, how her behavior had become distant, and how she spoke of important negotiations. Everything began to take on a darker, more unpleasant meaning. "What should I do? How can I find out more?" Jacob asked, his voice almost a whisper. "You need to watch her more closely, Jacob. You can't just leave it as it is. If you uncover more evidence, we can act on it," Oscar advised. Jacob clenched his teeth, feeling his heart fill with frustration and helplessness. It was hard for him to believe that his entire life, his relationship with Brianna, could be built on lies. He didn't even know who he was dealing with anymore. After ending the call with Oscar, Jacob stood in front of the mirror, asking himself what he should do next. How could he trust the woman he loved if everything he was learning only made the situation worse? He replayed the moment when he saw her with Harry. He couldn't forget their embrace, the envelope, and that mysterious gesture. What was she giving him? What other secrets were they hiding? Now he couldn't just sit and wait. Jacob decided he had to learn more. He needed confirmation, something that could either validate or change his perspective on what was happening around him. Even with all his suspicions, he couldn't imagine that the outcome of this situation might completely destroy his life. But it was already too late, and he knew there was no turning back. Jacob couldn't sleep that night. The thoughts swirling in his mind wouldn't leave him alone. Why was Brianna acting this way? Why had she stayed late at work so many times? And why hadn't she told him anything about what was happening between her and Harry? With each passing day, his doubts grew stronger. Worse, he began to suspect that Brianna might not just be a victim of Harry's manipulations. It increasingly seemed to him that she might be an active participant in all these schemes. This question tormented him. He tried to scrutinize every step of her behavior, every glance, every small detail that might give him a clue. But every time, she seemed like nothing was wrong. She was the same Brianna he loved. But unfortunately, everything felt different now. The next morning, Brianna told Jacob she'd be staying late at work. She explained that there was a big exhibition at the gallery and that she'd have to help with preparations, working late into the night. Jacob heard her words, but they didn't bring him any peace. He told her it was fine and stayed home, but in his heart, he felt unease. Everything felt too rehearsed and overly justified. She seemed as she always did, but somehow, this exhibition felt insincere to him. As soon as Brianna left, Jacob knew this was his chance. He decided not to wait but to act. His inner voice told him this was his only opportunity to uncover the truth. Jacob had long suspected that Brianna might be hiding something, and perhaps the biggest mistake would be to sit back and do nothing. He couldn't remain in the dark any longer. He needed to find out what was really happening between Harry and Brianna. So that evening, Jacob made his move. Quietly stepping outside, he slipped into the shadows and approached the fence separating his yard from Harry's. He didn't hesitate. There was no doubt in his mind that this was what he needed to do. Jacob climbed over the fence, careful not to make any noise, and cautiously approached the back entrance of Harry's house. He knew there was a window that could be opened quietly. As he slipped inside, his heart raced with tension. He had to be careful. The slightest mistake could ruin everything. The house was quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps coming from another part of the house. Jacob moved toward the doors and gently opened one. At that moment, he heard voices leading him to the living room. Brianna and Harry were sitting together, watching television and embracing. Jacob froze, but at the same time, his heart felt encased in ice. They looked so close, so mutually interested in one another that Jacob couldn't help but feel his soul shrink with pain. This was a completely different scene than he had imagined when thinking of his wife. Brianna laughed as Harry gently touched her shoulder. They were engrossed in the movie, but their movements, their gazes, everything made Jacob feel that there was more than just friendship between them. Jacob couldn't believe his eyes. They kissed and embraced, and in that moment, he realized there was more between them than he could have imagined. Then Harry turned to Brianna and said, "Are you ready to sign? Just a few details left. If we do this right, this deal could bring us a decent profit." Brianna smiled and replied, "Yes, I'm ready. There's just a little bit left to finalize." At that moment, Jacob realized that what he had seen wasn't just a private conversation or an innocent embrace. It was part of a bigger plan. They weren't just together. They were also involved in some kind of illegal business. The signatures were for forged contracts related to property sales. His hands trembled, and his breathing grew heavy. Jacob turned to leave without making a sound. Only one question echoed in his mind. How could Brianna be involved in this? How could she so easily and quickly get caught up in these crimes? As soon as he left Harry's house, Jacob felt his heart break from the weight of betrayal. He couldn't escape reality anymore. He realized his wife wasn't just cheating on him with Harry. She was also part of his schemes. This was a full-blown con, and he hadn't even suspected how deeply she was involved. Jacob couldn't let this go. He knew he had to do something. He needed to uncover more, gather evidence, and, if things were as he feared, act very carefully. But in that moment, he understood one thing. His life, the one he had spent so long building, was now in ruins. What would he do next? How would this affect his future? One thing was clear. Jacob couldn't leave it like this. Jacob woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. His mind was filled with doubt, fear, and anger. He didn't know what to do with what he had learned. All the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Brianna wasn't just a victim of Harry. She was part of his plan. She had been helping him manipulate people, orchestrating fraudulent schemes, all without a hint of shame or remorse. For Jacob, this was a devastating revelation. He had always believed in his wife, trusted her, and thought of her as reliable and devoted. But last night had changed everything. His thoughts led him to one conclusion. He needed to ensure this didn't go without consequences. So he decided to organize a dinner. Not an ordinary dinner, but one that would allow him to piece together the tangled web of this situation and bring everything to light. He invited Brianna, Harry, Oscar, and a few friends. Jacob knew that this time, he needed everything to be under control. The dinner had to appear as a casual gathering among close ones, with no suspicions, but he had a much bigger plan. He intended to create an atmosphere of calm and security, ensuring that none of the attendees would suspect his motives. But he had his own agenda. He was preparing for the moment when everything would come to light. Jacob prepared the meal himself, ensuring everything looked perfect. The dishes he made were delicate and flavorful, paired with carefully selected wine. He wanted the atmosphere to be light and unremarkable. During the meal, he had several plans in mind. However, this evening wouldn't simply be about food and conversation. When everyone gathered around the table, Jacob started with casual conversation. He joked, shared funny stories, and showed no signs of nervousness. He appeared calm and confident. Brianna sat beside him, smiling and seemingly carefree, while Harry looked slightly uneasy, despite trying to appear relaxed. As the dinner neared its end, Jacob felt the moment had come. He quietly stood and walked over to a projector on the table. His movements were deliberate and composed, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Jacob pressed a button, and an image appeared on the wall, photos and incriminating evidence about Brianna and Harry that he had collected over the past days. All eyes turned to the screen immediately. The first photo showed Brianna and Harry sitting together on the couch in Harry's house. They were embracing, laughing, followed by photos of documents Harry had handed Brianna in an envelope. The sequence included a picture of him kissing her goodbye and her leaving his house with a heavy package. The captions on the slides explained it all. Jacob carefully paused the presentation to give everyone time to absorb what they were seeing. The silence in the room was deafening. "What's this?" Harry asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice betrayed his panic. "This is the information I've uncovered about you, Harry, and it's just part of what I have," Jacob replied with cold confidence. He had been ready for this moment. Everyone's attention was fixed on the screen, and a mix of doubt and astonishment began to appear on some of the faces. Jacob continued, "I found this envelope. It's not just an envelope. Inside are documents. Forged documents related to property sales. Brianna, what do you have to say about this?" Jacob turned to his wife, waiting for her response. Brianna looked flustered. Her face went pale, and her eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out of the situation. She tried to speak, but her voice trembled. "It's not what it looks like, Jacob. You don't understand," she began, but Jacob cut her off. "Don't try to lie to me, Brianna. I know everything." He pulled another document from his pocket, the same envelope he had seen in Brianna's hands. It contained several signed papers confirming her involvement in Harry's schemes. "These documents are worth a lot. You owe me an explanation. Why are you and Harry doing this? How could you? How could you put our home at risk?" Jacob demanded, his voice growing more intense. Oscar, who had been sitting nearby, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "You knew this was happening, Jacob. Brianna and Harry have been in this together for a while. They thought you'd never find out. They played their game without even bothering to hide it fully." At that moment, Jacob realized that his wife was not only cheating on him, but actively aiding the man who was jeopardizing everything he had built. Now that everything was laid bare, Jacob felt his heart break from betrayal. "How could you?" he finally whispered, the disappointment evident in his eyes. Brianna couldn't respond. Her face was buried in her hands, and tears were already dripping onto the table. She knew there was no excuse she could offer. Harry attempted to change the situation, trying to say something, but Oscar, surprisingly supportive, stood up and added, "They both had a chance to step away from this, but they went through with it, and now they'll pay for it." Meanwhile, Jacob looked at his wife. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her. She had betrayed him not only as a wife, but also as a person. Jacob felt his anger slowly transform into cold resolve. All those years he had believed in his wife now seemed absurd and naive. He had no doubts left about her deceitful actions, and what he had seen was irrefutable evidence of her betrayal and involvement in Harry's schemes. There was nothing left to hide. This was the moment of truth. He turned to face the guests, who sat in tense silence, waiting for what would happen next. He could feel their gazes on him, some trying to comprehend the situation, others already understanding what was going on. Jacob knew this moment would be a turning point not only for his life, but also for the lives of everyone present. These people would now witness the collapse of his marriage, and he had no intention of sparing anyone. "So, shall we uncover the truth?" Jacob said with a cold glare directed at Harry and Brianna. His voice was calm, but there was no trace of the tenderness he had once felt for his wife. It was a mask he now had to wear to maintain control over the situation. He pressed a button on his phone, and a video appeared on the wall. It showed Brianna and Harry laughing and embracing, exchanging money and documents, the same documents that confirmed their schemes. Jacob didn't stop there. He played several clips showing them planning property sales and signing forged contracts, fully aware that their actions could destroy many lives, including his own. There you have it, the whole truth. Brianna and Harry have conspired in one of the most deceitful and cynical frauds I've ever seen. Jacob's voice was a wall of conviction that nothing could shake. He turned to his wife, searching her face for even a hint of remorse, but found none. Now, Brianna, I'm not interested in what you have to say. I've found more than enough evidence to know who you really are. You're no longer the person I once loved. And because of that, I want nothing more to do with you, Jacob said, not pausing for a moment. He walked over to the table where her belongings lay. He opened her bag, pulled out her documents, car keys, mobile phone, and a few personal items that reminded him of their life together. He placed them on the table and calmly said, "Here are your things. I won't live in lies and manipulation anymore. You don't deserve my forgiveness. I'm filing for divorce." At that moment, Harry, who had seemed calm, finally broke. His face turned from pale to red as he tried to say something, but Jacob didn't give him a chance. He already knew who Harry was and had no desire to listen to more lies. "And you, Harry, can pack your things and prepare for court. I'm filing a lawsuit against you for fraud. Everything you've done will leave a mark. And if you think I'll stop here, you're wrong," Jacob said, turning to Harry once more. Harry tried to justify himself, but Jacob wasn't listening anymore. He turned back to Brianna, looking into her eyes, searching for even a sliver of regret. "Do you know why I can't forgive you? Because you didn't just betray me. You set both of us up. You put me in harm's way with all these people, and you didn't just betray me physically but morally. You destroyed everything we built over the years," Jacob said, not holding back his indignation. He went to his phone and sent an official message that included a lawsuit against Harry. Everything was in order, and he was confident he could prove their guilt. After hitting send, he heard a chime. It was his lawyer confirming that all the steps had been taken. "Your lives will never be the same again," Jacob said, turning his attention back to Harry and Brianna. His heart wasn't filled with hatred, but there was no room for forgiveness either. The next few hours passed like a blur. The guests were stunned, everyone silent, unsure how to react. Jacob felt the emotional tension slowly leaving his body, but he wasn't ready to stop. He walked to the door, grabbed his bag, and left the house without a word. He didn't look back. After that evening, Jacob moved into a new home, leaving his past behind. It wasn't just a physical relocation, but also a spiritual cleansing. He knew he no longer wanted to be part of a world built on lies and manipulation. A fresh start was on the horizon, and he was ready for it. Saying goodbye to Brianna was final. He had no desire to see her again because she had become a stranger to him. And although it was painful, Jacob felt it was the best decision he could make for himself. What do you think might happen if you found out your spouse was hiding important secrets? Can you trust what you see at first glance, or is there always more beneath the surface? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective.